afternoon, and thank you all for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 1 meeting related to supply commitment and resource efficiency evaluation topics. My name is Elisandra Casillas, representing the California ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I'll be providing support for today's meeting. Mark Richardson is the facilitator, and Bob Cott is the scribe for this working group, and Bill Pettingale is the coordinator overseeing all three of the added EDAM working groups. Next slide, please. For today's agenda, after my welcome and introduction, I will turn the meeting over to Mark Richardson to kick off today's meeting, then to Mark Rothleader, Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the ISO, to continue the discussion on confidence in EDAM transfers, followed by Bob Cott with a recap discussion, then back to Mark Richardson to close today's meeting with upcoming topics. And with that, we will go to the next slide. Some meeting reminders. If you have questions at any time during the presentation, please raise your hand and Mark will call on you when it is your turn in the queue. Once your line has been unmuted, please start by stating your name and affiliation. These meetings are recorded and we post the video files on the corresponding working group web pages where you'll find the other materials related to these meetings. The recordings and any other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Please submit EDAM working group inquiries using the link on the resources slide at the end of this presentation or email to isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark Richardson.
Thank you, Ellie. Can you confirm you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, team. I really do appreciate everyone staying engaged and hanging in there these past 10 weeks. Apologies for the link issue. Hopefully everyone received my email or Ellie's email with the updated link, and feel free to forward that on to those you know that participate in this meeting. So today marks our last working group meeting on supply commitment and resource sufficiency. I must say it has been an extremely fruitful ride. Last Monday, we continued our discussion around the confidence and certainty of EDAM transfers, with the SRP team being kind enough to provide some examples to help set up that conversation. As you all may be aware, this topic is extremely critical to a successful EDAM design. Mark Rothleader has been following our conversations closely and wanted to help tee up today's discussion, given it is the last one, by taking stock in where we are and where our conversations have guided us over these past 10 weeks, and then to lay out some of the concepts and elements we heard pertaining to the confidence of the EDAM transfers these past few sessions. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut it off there and ask Mark Rothleader to take over here and help guide the conversation today.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead, sir.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. And if anybody asks for Mark, just say the last name too, because we have two Marks on the line here. First off, I have been monitoring. I have not been able to actually listen to every work group session, but I've either been monitoring or I've been getting debriefed regularly on the outcomes of the meetings and the progress of the meetings. I guess from what I have observed and what I've been briefed on, like Mark said, I think that the discussion has been very fruitful and I think robust in the sense it seemed to cover a broad scope of topics that we were intending to cover. And I think kind of culminating it with this idea of that confidence question: how confident can you rely on the EDAM and the EDAM transfers, and what's the consequence of that, is really an important culmination point, because I think it builds on how well we did in terms of, or how well the design up to this point progressed and helps support that confidence. So I want to, before I go into my observations and kind of recast this whole confidence discussion, I do want to say thank you again to the ISO staff that has been participating along the way. Obviously, all the stakeholders that have been enduring the pace of this discussion and all the other work groups. I know it's a big lift, but we appreciate that there's a commitment, as evidenced by the fact that we have still over 100 attendees participating in these discussions. So the last thing I say before I get into the substance is, I did observe that as we got into more and more deeper substance and I guess consequential matters, and we were getting towards the end of the process, I did sense that the level of tensions and, frankly, our ability to be in listen mode only or listen mode and not has been somewhat more challenging. And I think that's good. I think it indicates that we're progressing into things that we need to discuss, but it also reinforces the fact that we need to continue to be open to ideas, and as we transition to the straw proposal, I think there will be opportunities to also be open to ideas and making sure that the straw proposal is just that. It's a starting point. We're trying to get more formal comments in that will be helping us guide the rest of the design. So before I go into substance, I want to see if there's any questions.
All right, so if you wouldn't mind raising your hands, I can call on you, or pressing #2. I don't see any hands in the queue at this time, Mark.
Sounds good. Okay, so I'm building this discussion around the confidence question. We discussed it on Monday. It was a good discussion, but I found it didn't get focused enough on some of the build-up to what happens before real time and how EDAM, by design, helps address some of the confidence. And what I mean by that is that there's several new design elements that are either EDAM or, in some cases, the day-ahead market enhancements itself that actually build that confidence. And what I mean by that confidence is, and I think George put it well when he said, what are we talking about here? We're going to have a wide range of capability to absorb a lot of uncertainty, which I completely agree with, but I want to take a look back of how we got there. So first off, we know that there is a resource adequacy programs, and we know that by design, it's those resource adequacy programs and capabilities that come into the day-ahead market. And I understand there's some discussion about, well, is there symmetry or is there a common level of resource adequacy program coming into the day-ahead market? And I think the honest answer is no. I think we know that there are different resource adequacy programs. There is different IRPs. And I think from the onset, setting the expectation that EDAM is not going to create a common RA program across the West or across the EDAM footprint was, I think, a realistic expectation. And I think that is true. And that's why we refocused our efforts on the resource sufficiency test. And the resource sufficiency test was intended to be that common ground, common assessment that would be applied to all, and that would level set that at least coming into the day-ahead market, there was a sufficient capacity and sufficient resource commitment to make the day-ahead market robust in terms of being able to meet the forecast demand, bid-in demand, and also any uncertainty around the forecast and demand. So we then said, we talked about a good approach, and I think we came to some pretty good solutions in terms of how to run that test. And then there was some discussion around consequences of that test. I don't think the consequence discussion completed. but I think there was at least a good, robust discussion about the range or the types of consequences we should be considering. I think there's some expectation. If there's not, I think I want to be clear that there is an expectation that if we get to EDAM, we've also implemented day-ahead market enhancements, which introduces an imbalance reserve requirement into the integrated forward market. Why that's important is because it further builds the confidence and the capacity that clears the integrated forward market that we can meet the level of uncertainty, supply uncertainty, and while currently that's probably being done largely through the residual unit commitment, introducing it into the integrated forward market builds confidence not just around the overall solution, but builds confidence in the amount or the what clears the integrated forward market, and leaves less to potentially unravel or be degrading confidence when you get to the residual unit commitment itself. So I think that's the purpose of the imbalance reserve, and building that uncertainty into the integrated forward market, again, building confidence. There is the residual unit commitment itself, and I think there was some very good discussion about what is the role of the residual unit commitment. I don't think there's a complete common understanding of the role of integrated forward market. How is it used to clear bid-in demand? Should it be used to clear forecast demand, or is that uncertainty between really incorporating the imbalance reserve capacity, or what is the residual role of the residual unit commitment in a kind of a day-ahead market enhancement mode where we have built-in uncertainty into the IFM? My view is that RUC still has an important role. My perspective is RUC has probably some important role, but I think we need to be clearer about it, and people have to be considered about whether RUC has a role in an EDAM balancing area. I don't think there's a conclusion on that. I think my perspective is there is a role there, and I think we'll be articulating that and what that role should be or could be in the straw proposal. There was probably less agreement around the role of convergence bidding, and I don't want to press on that, but I think there is a role, but I don't think there is, in my view, there's an absolute need to have convergence bidding across the EDAM footprint. But I think the question then is, what are the implications of having convergence bidding in one area and not the other, and what do we have to think about in doing that? So I think if I then kind of roll from the day ahead, which now if we embed imbalance reserve requirement for the uncertainty, we clear the market across the EDAM footprint. I think there is now a clearer understanding whether we can meet the expected load requirements and the uncertainty. Before I leave the day ahead, I think there's an important question that has been raised by California entities, and that is, are we recognizing the role of resource adequacy resources in California in the sense that those resources should be able to meet the load in California as a first premise. If the load is not high enough and there's surplus energy, I think my view is those resource adequacy resources should be able to participate and be able to meet other demand in the market. It's a value to them. I think it's an important value to them. But then there's an ancillary question comes up as well. If they are meeting other commitments in the market, what is the expectation about those the demand that those are supporting, and what is the expectation again around confidence? My view is that, again, if we get everything right in the day-ahead market, we build the uncertainty in, there's a high degree of confidence, and we would only have those resource adequacy resources basically be serving other demand to the extent we can meet the demand, including what's built up into the uncertainty in the first place in the day-ahead market. So I think what comes out of that is that you should have confidence that if there is external demand being met by those resource adequacy resources, it's done so in an environment that we have confidence that we can serve those, and there's not a high degree of risk that those loads can't be served. So that's another question that has to be answered affirmatively, that we have satisfied that threshold. Let me stop here before I go on into, if we get these design right, what is then kind of the happy path when you go into the real time and what the different scenarios could be. Bobby did a great job of setting up some scenarios. I want to be a little bit more precise about what happens in some of these scenarios, both in the happy path where you have now leveraged your capacity that you procured day ahead in real time, and the kind of the benefits of the EDAM that we observe, but then the unhappy path. What happens if our uncertainty that's realized exceeds the amount of capacity that we procured in advance in the day ahead market? So let me stop to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Mark. All right, first hand up is Michelle Keto from the CPUC. Event producer, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Michelle's line. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hey, Mark, this is Michelle. What about the asymmetry between CAISO and other balancing authorities, where other balancing authorities may only have to just meet their resource efficiency, whereas California entities, all their resources up to the peak are offered in? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah.
Regard, you could hold back some.
Yeah. So Michelle, I think I understand the question, and I do acknowledge maybe there is some asymmetry, but this notion that everything under RA is necessarily must offer, and that you're always going to have this large surplus, is not really the case. I think there's obviously resources that are not must offer, and they're going to be shaped, in the case of variable resources, shaped to their capability at the time, their available production at the time. There are other resources that may be limited, energy limited or use limited because of their field capability. So this notion that there is this large asymmetry, that somehow California has a bunch of capacity that is must offer and no one else is putting in all their capacity, I'll buy into the fact that maybe there is some asymmetry in that, but I don't think my view is that asymmetry is a real problem. I think if we get the incentives right, external balancing areas, one, will have to meet their resource efficiency evaluation, which includes a level of uncertainty. I think they have the incentive to provide capability beyond their resource efficiency, because they are looking for the value of the EDAM, and I hope the incentives are created that value does incentivize them to do that. So I guess I acknowledge maybe the asymmetry exists, but I don't think I'm feeling that just because of that asymmetry that it undermines the EDAM existence or the confidence that needs to be built in through the day ahead and the real time conditions.
Okay, well, let me just, okay. But one more question. So as the market is currently structured, if California does need those resource adequacy resources, they are able to pull them back through the real time, right? Because through the RUC adjustments, you can not give day ahead priority to exports. And so going into the real time, you can pull them back. And to me, I'm having a hard time understanding how this is a step forward in terms of reliability if we are committing those exports in the day ahead time frame.
Because, and I'll just be short and then we can get into some of the examples, I think the commitment of that those transfers out are built around now where uncertainty is built into the integrated forward market. And I understand it's going to be dependent on somewhat the parameters and the quantity of the imbalance reserve, but the fact that you're doing that up front in the integrated forward market, I think it puts the confidence that what clears the integrated forward market can be truly supported and doesn't leave it to just the residual unit commitment process to undermine that or reverse that because its objective is to try to achieve another level of reliability.
Okay, I guess my response would be that the imbalance reserve product is much less in terms of than the RUC adjustments, and so to me it doesn't necessarily seem obvious that it's more reliable. So I guess we'll go through these examples, and then I guess the other thing is, it really then depends on this forecasting methodology, and I would note that we've had some trouble with this idea of forecasting the Flex-U ramp requirement, the net load uncertainty, the intertie deviation. And since it's hard to do even that, this seems even harder and even larger and even more important. So with that, those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank
Kevin.
you, Michelle. All right.
Go ahead, Mark. I'll let you control the names.
Okay, thank you. Kevin Smith.
Hey, Kevin Smith with Bank. I was going to say Mark R, but they're both Mark R's too. So I don't want to argue magnitude of asymmetry, but I thought, Mark, your response was good. I would just add that each of the entities, EDAM entities, retain balancing authority obligations. So it's different as a PTO load-serving entity in CAISO than an individual entity, an EDAM entity, which has to meet its reliability obligations. And so there's even an asymmetry on that side as well. And so we don't shed our obligations if we join an EDAM. Now, quantifying these two, which one do you err? Do they cancel each other out? I wouldn't argue that at all. I would just say that, we're trying to mix two worlds. It's not a perfect alignment. We're hoping we can get close enough to make these things coexist. But it's not a perfect alignment, but there are asymmetries on both sides.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right, Mark, that is all we had in the queue. You ready for us to pull up the example slide deck and dive in?
Yeah, I think so. Let's go ahead and so these examples are kind of derivatives of what Bobby presented last time, and let's just go through it and see if I get it right. And George, please, I'm going to probably rely on you to correct me if I go through these incorrectly or I state them incorrectly. So the simple example starting out, we've got 1,000 megawatts of capacity in the three areas that are in EDAM, presumably. And if you go click again. So now we have basically the demand forecast, which I think is synonymous to say, let's assume that's our target for what we're clearing day ahead. I'm not getting into all the nuances, whether it clears IFM or through RUC. I'm just saying that that's really the target forecast. And we have about 2,300 megawatts of forecast across the combined areas, with each area having sufficient capacity to meet both the demand forecast plus the identified reserves. So I want to distinguish here, because I think it's an important distinction that I think George was trying to make last time, that there's reserve, and I'm going to classify that as contingency reserve versus uncertainty, which is a broader set of reserve to cover load uncertainty, higher load than forecast, variable resource uncertainty. So it's a broader set, and I'll explain why that's important and with the subsequent slides. So So I guess with this, we have 300 megawatts of contingency reserve and then 300 megawatts of uncertainty needs that need to be met. So I guess if you look at our net requirement or net capacity, I guess area A has 0 remaining, area B has 70 megawatts remaining, and area C has 5 megawatts remaining if we assume that the day ahead is satisfied all the demand and reserve plus uncertainty needs. So there's a 75 megawatt of surplus above and beyond the uncertainty that is already going to be available to us later on. So, George, did I capture that correctly so far?
Yes, Mark.
Okay. All right. So let's continue on. So, so with this solution, we see that presumably we come out of the result where we have energy transfer. This is economic optimization, so it comes out with 100 megawatt transfer from area A to area B, and then 100 megawatt energy transfer from area B to area C. The imbalance reserve, where we carry the imbalance reserve in this case, and this is an economic outcome, not because of the transfers necessarily, but just because where the imbalance reserve was most economically held, it was basically held in 100 megawatts is in area B, 200 megawatts in area C. And the green bars back, I think, are indicative of representing what can happen then in real time, or no, sorry, let me not go there. It's just the kind of, if you want to say the flow of imbalance reserve, if there was an event, is that correct, George? If there was an event in A, the imbalance reserve would flow back from the capacity that was procured in B or C back to A. Is that what this is trying to convey?
That's correct. This is what we call imbalance reserve up transfer. It's a capacity transfer, which essentially reserves transmission capacity so that if you need to deploy that imbalance reserve in area C to meet requirements in area A, that transmission capacity is available for exactly that purpose.
Okay. So the imbalance reserve or the counterflow created by that, if you were to deploy it, is not canceling the original transfer, energy transfer, but it is counterflowing if it were deployed. Is that correct?
That's correct. In this example, if all the uncertainty materializes in area A, you have essentially the area C having 100 megawatt of deployment of imbalance reserve up, which could serve the uncertainty in area A, or you can see the same result as being counterflowing on or reducing the energy transfer, in which case the capacity that was supplying this energy transfer in area A is now available to meet the uncertainty in area A. So these are all co-optimized in real time, those two events.
Okay. So the reason why I say EDAM with the imbalance reserve built in creates this now room to maneuver and absorb that uncertainty I think is really illustrated by this. So even though we had a 100 megawatt transfer going from A to B, between the available bids and the imbalance reserve capability, we have the ability to flex back. It's not curtailing energy that was transferred. It's just basically maneuvering and have that flexibility to absorb realized uncertainty in A or B or C, and the energy would flow where that uncertainty is realized. And so I'm just trying to express that EDAM itself, along with the enhancements to the day-ahead market, create this additional flexibility and ability to absorb the uncertainty, which reduces the risk that we get into these type of emergency conditions that we will be discussing later when we get down to the unhappy path. So we will much more likely and optimally be on a happy path where we have enough capacity, we can meet all the load, meet all the realized uncertainties, and we can do it economically without having to go to extra or manual measures. And I want to maybe re-engage Bobby because, again, Bobby, you set up these examples. You did a very good job, but I just wanted to see if this resonates with you and is consistent with your observations and setting up your examples of EDAM and the interplay between EDAM and ultimately real time. And does this notion of the reserve plus the uncertainty, is that consistent with how you expected it to play out?
Producer, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Bobby Olson's line, I'd appreciate it.
Hey, Mark. Bobby Olson, SRP. In general, this is how I expected it to play out and was attempting to set it up. I think this does a much better job of explaining more in kind of the ISO perspective in terms of how the examples would be expected to flow through. Following along, I think we will obviously have questions with respect to the imbalance reserve and how that gets carried and transferred, but holistically, this is consistent with what we were trying to do.
Okay. Thanks, Bobby.
And then, Mark, we also had a hand up from Jeff Nelson at SCE if you wanted to go to Jeff's line.
Hi, guys. Good afternoon, Jeff Nelson, SCE. I just want clarifying questions before the examples get going to make sure I'm following along. Just looking at area A, we have an available capacity of 1,000 and a demand forecast of 800, and then reserve and uncertainty of 100. Is the energy flowing from A part of that 800 megawatt demand forecast, or is that energy flowing from its uncertainty capacity?
I think the extra 100 megawatt is flowing above the 800. I think the 800 is the internal area forecast, not inclusive of the energy flowing from area to A, from area A to B. Is that correct, George?
Yes, that's correct. Essentially, you have 1,000 megawatt of available capacity in area A. 900 of that is scheduled as energy, 800 to meet the demand forecast, 100 to be transferred out, and then another 100 megawatt, the remaining 100 megawatt of capacity is the contingency reserve, meeting the reserve requirements for area A.
Okay, good. I'm just clarifying, sorry, examples. And the second one was sort of a follow-on. Are these uncertainty reserves available for energy dispatch as part of the IFM without sort of being substituted anywhere else, I guess?
Well, they're determined in the IFM. They're procured in the IFM, and so they, to the extent there are upward uncertainty or imbalance reserve procured, they are not energy when coming out of IFM, but they are capacity that then moves to the real time to absorb any of those uncertainties that are realized between day ahead and real time.
Yeah, so I think something's a little wrong with the example then, which was adding my confusion. I think, yeah, because the only way you're getting that extra 100 megawatts from A, and again, let me make sure I got my color codes set up too. Again, just trying to get the example clear in my head. These sort of orange-yellow arrows are the IFM or the day-ahead transfers, correct?
The yellow,
yes,
the yellow. Go ahead, George. Go ahead, George.
Yeah. So both arrows are also both the results of the day-ahead market. The yellow arrows are energy transfers, and the green arrows are capacity transfers. So as you said here, Jeff, you have what you're missing here is, and that's what you're wondering about. Who's covering the uncertainty of 100 megawatts in area A? Because, as I said, you have 1,000 megawatts of available capacity, 100 serves the reserve as capacity, and the other 900 is an energy schedule serving 800 of the demand forecast and 100 megawatt the energy transfer out. So then your question, I think it is, hey, what happens with the 100 megawatt of uncertainty in area A? So here, the economic solution is to procure the imbalance reserve for that in area C. And that's why you see these green arrows, which basically are capacity transfers that say that area C is covering the imbalance reserve requirement for its own area plus the one in area A.
Okay, that really helps. I thought the green arrows were real time and the yellow arrows were day ahead. All of these arrows are day ahead, and that clarifies my question. Okay, thank you very much. Again, just trying to get clarity. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, let's go to Stephen Pruitt's line.
Yeah, hi. I think you guys just answered it. Maybe make sure I've got it. So the IFM economically dispatches 100 megawatts out of A over to C, and to cover the uncertainty, it also awards 100 megawatts of reserves from area C to area A. Is that correct?
Yes.
George? Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, and then lastly, let's go to Lindsay's line from Nevada.
Hi, Lindsay Schleckway from NV Energy. So I was wondering with the capacity that is awarded in Area C to serve A, is transmission reserved, or how does how is that saved?
Thanks, Lindsay, for mentioning it, because that's another element of the confidence building, and I forgot to mention. So by the time we get to EDAM, we will be presumably implementing and procuring both real-time flex ramp and imbalance reserve based on deliverability, meaning that we would only procure that capacity if it was feasible to achieve and get to the demand. So that's a tough question. That's a tough algorithm to do, but this is a more deliverable and feasible deliverability than what you see in flex ramp today. We are implementing deliverability enhancements to that will be coming, I think, fall of next year for the real time.
Okay. Okay, I think that helps. And then one other question, and maybe you haven't thought this far through, but will it also, I guess, if it's reserved, or I guess what I'm wondering is, would the award also include that hurdle rate? Would it consider the hurdle rate from the day-ahead transmission of whatever that ends up being?
To the extent it's exposed to that hurdle rate, I think the answer is yes, but I'm going to ask George to confirm.
Okay.
Yes, if any of these transfers here were a bucket 3 transfer that has a transmission fee for using it, that would be factored into the optimal solution in EDAM. So the transfer, either the capacity transfer or the energy transfer, would only be scheduled if its economics are for scheduling that higher, overcoming the transmission fee on that particular bucket 3 transfer. Going into real time, obviously there are no bucket 3 transfers. All transmission is available and free. The key outtake of these examples, and I think that's what Mark will go through these slides, is that the transmission capacity that is released in EDAM and it's used for these transfers, this is the firm aspect of the market. We expect that this transmission capacity will be available in real time if it's used in day ahead. So specifically for the capacity transfers here that are shown in green, and that's answering your question, how are we making sure that this capacity is going to be available? We expect that this capacity, being a day-ahead capacity transfer, to be maintained in real time, so that when the uncertainty materializes in area A in real time, there is this transmission capacity available, so that the imbalance reserve awards in area C will be dispatched, and through that capacity that's available, they can meet uncertainty in area A.
Okay. All right. I think that helps. I'll need to think about it some more, but thank you.
Thank you. I saw Michelle and then I didn't. Is Michelle, do you have a question?
Yeah, this is Michelle from CPC. I figure this is where the thing's going to be brought up, but I don't think these slides are up on the website yet, so I can't go ahead. But I guess my question is, you know, if EDAM were just one big circle, I get that you can always redispatch the imbalance reserves up. But since CAISO is dispatching both EDAM and intertie resources, or just resources in general, it gets more complicated. So if this top energy, 100 megawatts, wasn't coming from area A, but was coming from a non-EDAM entity, and then as a result, you have a firm transfer from B to C, and let's say area A turns down 100 megawatts because it no longer has a real-time must-offer obligation, those are the kinds of issues that I see with the interface between EDAM and non-EDAM entities. And it's not clear to me that we've determined who takes the risk when that energy at the intertie doesn't show up.
Well, okay, so you can quickly complicate this. I'm not ignoring your question, but I think I'm setting this up to be, this is all EDAM area, and just to make some points, I think the notion of a non-EDAM area and having just intertie bids, either be other supply coming into A or coming into B, I don't think it's a big lift to make that clear, but I guess I would say it builds on the existing notion of low priority and high priority exports, whether they have identified non-RA capacity. That would be my first comment. And I think I would just say that the existing rules and priorities would stand in terms of if we lost an intertie and we lost supply in an area. I think the natural outcome is then we either are relying on contingency reserve, which we're allowed to do if it's an instantaneous loss of an intertie. If it's a slow loss of schedules, we may have to rely on the uncertainty deployment to respond to that. And again, I think the answer is we would leverage the entire IRU uncertainty that was procured to respond to that type of event if it was a non-instantaneous contingency event.
Okay, and I guess I would just say that under the current framework, we have the ability to cut the exports that were held back because of the RUC adjustments that CAISO made.
And I would just say at this point, and we can continue that discussion, for non-EDAM areas, I think that mechanism would still exist, and I would let's hold on what happens to EDAM transfers as a result of this to the end of the story. So I just say be patient a little bit on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, let's go to Terry Bentley from WPTF, and then we'll move into the next slide.
Hey, this is Terry Bentley. Thanks, WPTF. Thanks, Mark, for the great intro. I think this is building on Lindsay's question a little bit, and maybe if you want to say this till later, that's fine too. I understand how the counter looks like, you know, the energy award is supported by the counterflow, or maybe you're saying the IRU award is supported by the energy counterflow. But assuming a scenario where your transfers only exist because one of the products is providing counterflow for the other, given that IRU is an uncertainty product and may not materialize in real time, are you going to treat it more like energy, or are you going to treat it more like an ancillary service where you don't allow it to support the counterflow for an energy transaction?
Well, so we will, if to the extent that it turns into energy because we dispatch the underlying awarded capacity, it will become energy in real time if the uncertainty is actually realized. If the uncertainty is not actually realized, we may not have to deploy the IRU and convert it to energy.
Right, and in that event where the day ahead flows were only that transfer capability was only available because the IRU was providing counterflow, wouldn't then the energy transfers no longer be feasible?
Oh, good question. Let me clarify that. So I don't think the, George, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the IRU is only feasible because it's relying on the counterflow of the energy. Isn't that deliverable and not relying on the counterflow, or correct? How does that work in terms of the feasibility of that counterflow?
So in this example, the imbalance reserve has its own transfer, and it doesn't have to be counterflowing the energy. We actually don't consider the capacity transfers providing counterflow for energy in the opposite direction. They're just different. They have their own schedule that is still calculated optimally. But through the deployment scenarios, as Mark mentioned earlier, specifically for the FRP as well, we're doing it together now, we're making sure that what we procure as imbalance reserve or flexible ramp in real time, they're all deliverable, subject to all transmission constraints, including the scheduling limits on intertie capacity. So this example here shows that there is a counterflow of capacity which together with the energy flow in the other direction is an optimal solution, and area A is able to provide this 100 megawatt energy transfer export, although it is tight if you look at what the RSC did. And this is only possible in this example only because the requirement for imbalance reserves to meet the uncertainty in area A are optimally provided by capacity, unloaded capacity that gets an award for imbalance reserve in area C. So you see this effect here, but when we move into the next slide, you'll see a different effect where those two are not one making room for the other. You can have an independent optimal solution that this can flow. Yeah. So it's not that because you have the energy transfer, you can have the imbalance reserve transfer in the opposite direction. This is only in this example.
Yeah, thanks, George. That's what I was expecting to hear. Does that answer your question, Carrie?
I think so. I think maybe more plainly, it would be helpful to state that an IRU award would not enable an energy transaction, because that's the fundamental concern.
Yeah. So yeah, the energy is not flowing, is not feasible just because the IRU capacity. That is definitely not the case. The energy is feasible unto itself.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. And I know Stephen Pruitt was hands up and then hands back down. I just want to make sure that we don't ignore a question he may have.
I believe Stephen left his hand up there.
There it goes. Yep, let's unmute his line. His hand's back up.
Oh, sorry, I was trying to take it down. I couldn't see if it was up or down.
No worries.
It's okay, Stephen. I put it down for you.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
My arm was getting tired.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so before I leave the slide, I just want to emphasize again, this is all illustrative, but I do want to make the point that the uncertainty is trying to, my understanding is the IRU is trying to cover a 97.5 percentile uncertainty band. So it's a high degree of latitude of realized uncertainty. And RUC today, at least in summer conditions, we do try to target that higher level when we do RUC in a summer time condition, but it's not the 50% load. It's a 97.5 percentile load. So. Okay, so if we're comfortable here, we'll just want to maybe move on to the next slide, which is different because I wanted to make it sure that it was clear that that last slide was just where the imbalance reserve capability was economically determined. It doesn't necessarily mean that the imbalance reserve follows the energy transfer. So we could have easily assuming we had enough capacity, in this case, the capacity has changed in area A, okay, to 1,300. As long as we have enough capacity, you can see that if it was economic to do so, we could pick up imbalance reserve all in A, and so long as we have deliverability pathways to B and C, we could theoretically pick up our reserve in area A. That capacity would be compensated, presumably, and if we needed to deploy it, I just wanted to be clear here that deployment of imbalance reserve is not always going to just counterflow the energy transfers that occurred and cleared the day ahead market. And the reason I want to emphasize that is because that IRU and the energy are separate schedules, and that schedule is that energy schedule is a schedule that you can confidently rely on. If we counterflow it because we dispatch IRU or other economic bids, it's because we have available bids and we have the capacity to do so, and there's an economic solution to do so. And I think that's what George was trying to emphasize last time, where we were trying to answer the question, well, why are you, I think we were trying to struggle, well, why are you even getting into the position that you even have to think about cutting any kind of exports? You don't have to think about that, at least in these scenarios up to this point, because there's plenty of capacity to get a solution if contingencies or any uncertainty is realized. So let me stop there and see if there's questions.
All right, any questions out there for what was just stated and emphasized? I'm not seeing any hands, Mark.
Okay. George, did I miss anything on this revision of, or this version of the slide?
No, all is good.
Okay. All right. So let's go to the next slide and talk about some of the conclusions that kind of stem from this. So I think the question we were trying to answer, what is the scheduling priority of the transfer? I don't know if I'd put it this way, no priority, it is scheduled economically. I think that is correct, but it is a schedule, and it is a schedule that you can confidently rely upon, in part because we know we've got a level of uncertainty procured to back it up, and we know that that uncertainty capability in the imbalance reserve is deliverable. So having it say no priority, I think you can say it's a confident schedule. Now, do you call it a firm schedule? Do you call it something else? I think we'll have to discuss what does it get tagged as. I don't know if I have an answer today. How does it get tagged? But I think just like any other schedule that comes out of the day ahead market that's cleared, I think in this case it's a confident schedule that you can rely upon, and you have a high degree of confidence that it is supported, and in 99% of the cases, and I'm making up my numbers, it's not going to change unless the schedule doesn't change. It may get counterflowed just by economics later on, but that's not degrading or canceling the schedule. I want to stop there and see if there's any questions.
All right, we got Jeff Nelson from SCE in the queue.
Again, so this is really just a firm schedule, and this goes back to the conversation on Monday. You have the line. Can you go back one slide? Just one slide in your deck. You've got a line there, reserves, and those reserves are actually the contingency reserves.
Yes.
Yeah, my thesis is that those reserves are a function of those energy schedules, those yellow bars. And in some cases, it may not matter to the BA because they may be spinning for a single largest contingency. This doesn't matter. You know, they've got the reserves to cover it. In other cases, it may be that they're not spinning for the largest contingency, and they're going to have to carry some additional reserves.
So I don't want to get diverted, but in terms of reserve requirements and all that. But I think the current standards as a balancing area must maintain reserves to cover the greater of 3% of their load plus 3% of their generation or the single largest contingency in their area. And so it really doesn't, except for the fact that the generation may be supporting a transfer, it's not directly related to the energy transfer itself.
Well, I thought it was load plus exports that they had to carry for. I'm sorry if I misunderstood.
I'm going to let anybody else closer to this correct me if I'm misinterpreted what I think I know.
Okay, I don't want to distract, but I'll
it's okay. It's a little diversion, but it's a good diversion. Bobby?
Yeah, Mark, you're correct from a contingency perspective. I'm not the BA guy, but it has been drilled in my head. It is 3% load, 3% generation. Exports are often supported by generation, so it's reflective of there to get to the question that Jeff is asking.
Yeah, and that changed a couple of years ago from a explicit transfer, firm transfer. I think that changed a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay.
All right. Do you mind
Let's go back to yep.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Can we go to the next slide?
Go to the next slide. Yeah.
There we go. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay. So related to this is what is the firmness of the transfer? And I think when we think about firmness, we probably talk about the firmness of the transmission, which we assume that it's high reliable capacity because it's been made available, and we said that that is made available. In terms of the energy itself, again, I think this is a question that needs to be continued to be answered, but I'll just say at this point, it's a high confidence schedule, and it's supported, whether it be by the contingency reserve in a contingency situation or by the imbalance reserve under the if realized uncertainty is realized. So I just want to just leave it on the floor that how we tag it, what energy code it gets, I think we have to come to an agreement there, but I think it's high confidence, and we'll see how that plays out in the subsequent bullets. Does the transfer increase the reserve requirement? So I think we just answered that in response to Jeff's question. I don't think the transfer itself increases the reserve requirement, but we certainly will meet our reserve requirements, again, whether it be 3%, the 3% gen, 3% load, plus or the greater of that, or the single largest contingency. But in the examples, we have the imbalance reserve, but that's more to cover the uncertainty, and where that's carried will be determined optimally. So I think the answer to the question is that there's not an explicit reserve that's backing that transfer, other than the fact that the reserve that is covering the generation in an area is effectively the reserve that is supporting a contingency event. And I know I said a lot there and probably got confused, but let me see if there's any questions there.
All right, any questions? Oh, there we go, Stephen Greenlee. Let's go to Stephen Greenlee.
Hit the jackpot, okay.
Hey, Mark, how are you? Steve Greenlee, Brookfield. I hope you are well.
I think I'm well.
Just, I think that, and I apologize, I had gone off the call for about half an hour, but on this slide, I just, well, I had to, unfortunately. I wanted to just make sure I confirm my understanding. When you talk about scheduled economically and reoptimization, you're including self-schedules on this, right?
Well, the self-schedules, depending on whether they're established in day ahead and they roll to the day and to the real time, they will be there. If there's a new self-schedule in real time, it will be optimally determined whether that self-schedule can be supported or not in the real time.
Yeah, okay. So, but it falls within the rubric of scheduling economically. Obviously, it does establish a different scheduling priority.
Yeah, it has not an economic bid, but it has a penalty value that supports it.
Okay, that's it. I just wanted to confirm that. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, let's go to Robert Fisher's line.
Can you confirm you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Robert.
We can hear you, Robert.
This is Robert Fisher with NV Energy Hammer. I'm thinking through this re-optimized in real time. The area has a large amount of gas generation that is economically determined to be on the lower configuration in the day ahead, and then it's economically re-optimized in real time. The time horizon in real time is not going to be long enough necessarily to see the necessity to have resources in a higher configuration as a 24-hour time frame may. And if that transfer is re-optimized in real time, is that also going to include or possibly lead to modifications in how the current WEIM resource efficiency test is done?
So you open up a bunch of questions there that I think I can't fully answer today, but I think one of the notion is that will we be able to manage the configuration to the necessary configuration in a time frame that supports it in the real time? Will we have enough horizon outlook? Will we know enough, and will we have enough flexibility based on the constraints of the MSG resource to do that? I'd love to answer absolutely. But I know in reality that is a challenge today and will probably continue to be a challenge. So if we get stuck in a lower configuration that maybe affects our ability to access that imbalance reserve, I think we'll have to talk about mechanisms to force that along or ensure that. How we do that, I think that's probably a detail that I'm not prepared to answer today, unless George, you have a high-level answer.
It just with the unfirmness of the transfers from the day ahead to real time is really my concern. So I understand you're answering the. We'll keep thinking about it.
But I guess so. I'm not quite sure I understood that the unfirmness of the. Sorry, I didn't understand what you meant by that.
So if our generation fleet is economically determined to be at a lower level and a specific day ahead, and some things were to change, the re-optimization in real time without to try to get that energy to the right level and support without the firmness of the transfers from the day ahead is where my concern is.
Yeah, so I think either we find a way to do that and it supports the schedule from the day ahead and the conditions observed in the real time, or we find another solution absent that MSG resource moving to the higher configuration. But I think the objective would be that we support that transfer unless there's another economic solution that becomes available to us that counterflows it.
Yeah, Mark, if I can make a comment on this.
Yeah, please.
So yeah, the comment from Robert is very important because it realizes the fact that the real-time market is a different market with a different granularity than the day-ahead market. So what would portray here is a 24-hour solution where, of course, all the constraints, and particularly resource constraints and intertemporal constraints, are handled on an hourly basis. So the idea here is that if the EDAM is scheduling it, then it can be unwound economically in real time. That's the message that we convey here. But this is with complete ignorance to the fact that the real-time market is actually having a more granular time period, and it's a repeated market. It repeats every 15 and 5 minutes. So that element is not captured here in the 24-hour solution that we present in this example, which says, yeah, we have a transfer of 100 megawatts from A to B. What's the firmness of the transfer? Well, we're saying the transmission capacity that makes this transfer possible is firm. It's going to be there in real time. So what does it mean? If the real-time conditions are such that this transfer is still economic real-time, then you can count for it. It's going to be there for you because its transmission capacity is still available. If it's not economic, you can have a different solution that could even unwind that transfer. Okay, this is true for the day-ahead market because it's calculated based on the hourly resource constraints, whatever intertemporals, like MSGs that they need some time to transition and everything. So all of this is based on hourly time periods. But if you go into real time, and I think that's what Robert was going to, you have the granularity of those constraints are more severe. And we have seen situations in EIM that we discussed a few years back related to what operating reserve a BAA needs to provide for those EIM transfers. What we have seen is that because the market repeats itself and it has a limited time horizon, you could be building on the transfers, on the EIM transfers, interval after interval after interval, which says that in any 15-minute period, you can unwind the 15-minute transfer that you build up before, but over a period of time, say over an hour or two, continuing building those transfers, you will not be able to unwind them within one 15-minute period anymore. And that presented the requirement for having additional operating reserves because of these transfers that are getting to the point that you can unwind them, what we present here. So the notion that we have there in this third bullet that say, does a transfer increase reserve requirements in EDAM? That no there is only for EDAM. Obviously, there are exceptions that need to be considered in real time because of the fact that real time is having a different, more severe granular element that we need to consider, and we can discuss this further after you go into the unhappy scenarios, because that's where it becomes relevant in real time. We need to recognize that.
Thank you, George, for the answer. I appreciate it, and I understand what you're referring to in regards to the reserves. My question is really around the firmness of, or reoptimization aspect that you referred to in this first bullet. You kind of said there that transfer is firm from day ahead to real time, but then you also said it was reoptimized. So I'm a little confused in regards to that aspect. And then my second part of the question is the test going to change in real time?
So what we have said for the test so far is we committed to the fact that any day-ahead schedule, also the transfers, specifically for the day-ahead transfers, we will consider them in the real-time resource sufficiency evaluation, so we'll provide the proper credit for that transfer in the BA that receives it, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense to have a resource sufficiency evaluation in real time that would ignore what happened in EDAM. So far we took it, but we didn't really open up the scope to redesigning completely the EIM RSC because of EDAM. We just said that we will consider the day-ahead transfers in a similar manner that we consider the base transfers today in EIM for resource sufficiency evaluation.
So I understand everything you just said, and Robert, I appreciate the question you're asking. I think we probably lost about 60% of the people in that level of detail, but that's okay. I think I don't think there's anything I heard there that disturbs my premise or my theory that we are better off with EDAM and that we can manage the integrity of the transfer, the confidence in the transfer, and still shape in real time on a 15-minute basis further. But I do understand there's a nuance there that needs to be considered, and that is as we navigate 15-minute granularity, is there a new reserve component that gets implicated to support that? So I get that.
Yes, thanks, Mark and George. And I'm just looking forward to understanding that that priority and that reoptimization. And thank you very much for the answer.
Okay.
All right. So I believe Stephen Reedley's hand's up from previously, but I saw Bobby Olson's hand come up and then back down. So before we go to Stephen Pruitt, I wanted to check with Bobby Olson first.
Yeah, hi, Bobby Olson with SRP. I was actually thinking along similar lines to what Robert just raised. As we really looked at it, just wanted to kind of acknowledge and recognize that one of the things we see with EIM today is there are longer lead starts that units that kind of get committed, decommitted, kind of between the 4-hour and T-minus 75-minute. So just thinking about the implications to ensure that there's revisions as necessary to ensure capacity is available all the way through to serve those IRUs and not unintentionally decommitted and wind up with a little bit less reliable solution than intended.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we'll keep that on the radar. It's important as you transition from the day ahead, especially if we're picking up IRU. I'm not sure it's only an EDAM issue. I think it maybe manifests itself regardless of EDAM, but I think we have to keep that on the radar.
All right, let's go to Stephen Pruitt's line.
Yeah, Stephen Pruitt, LA again. On the last bullet, that question there, what if there is an outage on an intertie sports center? Does that assume that's within the EIM timeline? I would imagine that the outage happened before the EIM timeline, and after the EDAM optimization, the BA might try to work on that contingency.
I haven't gone there yet, so let me. And there's probably several sub scenarios, but we can go there. But I just wanted to clear the last set of questions out. But thank you.
All right, thanks.
All right, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Sure, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Really brief, the back and forth between Robert, Bobby, you and George, Mark, made me realize that I may have made an assumption about a big picture design element that's included in EDAM. And I was wondering if you could confirm for me if I just made this leap on my own, or, which I know I did because we haven't talked about big picture items, but I have always assumed that a part of joining EDAM also includes transitioning from the day ahead into real time, receiving binding startup instructions through the short-term unit commitment process to get those medium start units committed if necessary based on stuck horizon. Can you confirm that my assumption is this aligned with your expectation or not?
I think some of them will get binding if it can't be re-optimized or still decided in the real-time horizon. If it's something that can be considered in the real-time horizon, then I think it's not binding yet coming out of the day ahead. I think it's a nuanced answer.
No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, and I understand that it's not binding until it's binding startup instruction. I was just thinking about the longer lead time units that would need, let's say, 2-hour startup. Okay, cool. Thank you.
The longer stuff doesn't fall into a real time dispatch horizon or pre-dispatch horizon would get a binding commitment out of the day ahead.
And out of stuck.
And potentially out of stock for the stuff that's in the as of the board decision today, I guess 255-minute cycling time.
Yeah. Understood. Okay, just wanted to confirm I wasn't making too big of a leap to assume stuck would be used. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Mark, that's all we had for hands if you wanted to move on.
Okay. So now we're moving to kind of starting to go into unhappy conditions. And the unhappy condition that Michelle brought up last time, I think, was an important one. What happens if there's an outage on an intertie that supports a transfer? The answer to that is, well, if the intertie completely goes out and that transfer is cut, then I guess the first thing that happens is that seems like a contingency event, and it seems like at least for the first hour or the first 60 minutes, we can deploy our contingency reserves. Okay, and presumably, again, the contingency reserves will be enough to support that loss of the intertie. So the marginally happy case in this case is that we've got enough reserves to cover the loss of the intertie. The more unhappy case is if the intertie loss is greater than our single largest contingency, because it's not just a single largest contingency, it's a multiple contingency, multiple lines. And I think Michelle will always use the July 9th, 2021 event as the example, which is a multiple contingency event beyond the single contingency event. I think the answer under EDAM and under this new concept is the contingency reserve may not be sufficient, but we still have the uncertainty reserves, which we could still rely upon, that we procured, and we could also rely upon those. If we exhaust all those and there's not enough contingency reserve and imbalance reserve, and we're basically short of capacity, then I think we get into the unhappy state that we'll stand by, and we'll talk about on the next slide. So before I leave that, Michelle, you had a question.
Yeah, this is Michelle. So here's the question. Are you saying that Area B would have to use its contingency reserves, or Area C? I mean, let's assume that Area B is just the flow-through area, right? So the EDAM transfer is really coming through A, through B, to C. So who has to deploy their contingency reserves?
It's a bit more nuanced, and unfortunately, it depends on who's cutting those schedules and what schedules are getting cut. Because if in the case the balancing area A is the controlling balancing area for cutting those schedules, they may be cutting tags that flow all the way through and onto someone else, C, or they may be cutting tags that are only syncing in B. So it depends on the actual tags that are actually getting cut upon that transfer or schedule cuts.
Okay, so then, okay, so I get that. So we don't really know who has to bear the contingency reserves or the transfers, but I guess it really depends on the tag. So
Yep.
When we do these EDAM transfers, are we going to make clear that the EDAM transfer to C is effectuated by the transfer from A, or are we not going to know that?
Stand by. Okay.
All right. Let's go to Jeff Nelson, and then Mark, we have 30 minutes, and I think a lot of conversation is going to be spurred on that last slide, so maybe we'll jump there and then take questions.
Oops, I don't know if Michelle was finished.
Well, okay. Let me answer the question Michelle was asking, because I think if it's the EDAM transfer that was on the intertie and got cut, and I think the answer is we would economically, to the extent we could, pick up imbalance reserve and deploy our contingency reserve in the downstream systems. And I got to be careful here, because I realize I'm overstepping here. Imbalance reserve, certainly. Contingency reserve, because the contingency reserve is a balancing area function, except for the ISO, where we can economically deploy our contingency reserve. I think the answer to your question is yes, potentially B would be the sinking area for that transfer and would be eligible or able to deploy their contingency reserve, but they could also, B and C could economically deploy imbalance reserve in that particular case, in my mind.
Okay, and Mark, mine's a variation on what you were just saying, is that if instead it's just an import and there's no contingency, it's just the import doesn't show up, it just doesn't tag, I just confirming you don't have the ability to dip into contingency reserves, right? So you have
no,
to
then you're just in balance reserve, yes.
Okay, thanks for clarification.
And there's another scenario, and that is you didn't lose the intertie, or they start cutting schedules slowly. It's not an instantaneous loss. In that particular case, it's not going to be necessarily a contingency pickup. It's going to be an imbalance reserve pickup to compensate for the loss of supply.
And then in that case, there's no sort of like if the import was going into A and the import didn't show up, A has to use its contingency reserves. It's like whatever.
No, you just, yep.
Great, thanks.
George, did I go off the rails at all here? Or you're okay so far?
No, I think it's important though to distinguish the two steps in this process of the going into the unhappy scenarios. There is the ability of a market to find a solution, and that it's doing that with all the available bids. So that's what the first sub-bullet after the last one says and describes in the first example, that if you lose the intertie, obviously that 100 megawatt of energy transfer cannot flow anymore, so it needs to be cut. That energy was serving actually load in Area C. So now Area C can dispatch its reserve, its uncertainty reserve, its imbalance reserve to serve the demand. And then because of that energy doesn't flow out of A, there is now 100 megawatts of unloaded capacity in A. What the real-time market will do, it will realize that the intertie is no longer there. C cannot provide uncertainty coverage for Area A. We still need to procure flexible ramp in real time to meet the uncertainty. So what real time will do, it will use the 100 megawatt of available capacity now that is not supplying the export transfer to procure flexible ramp up for the uncertainty. So now the market acted as expected, found an economic solution out of this unhappy scenario, and we're good. The next step is what happens when the market fails to find a solution after trying everything it can.
Yeah. So before we move to the unhappy scenario, I just want to make a little bit of a conclusionary point. The degree of now solutions available for solving these happy and marginally happy solutions is greater under an EDAM and an EIM than what it would be without an EDAM and EIM. I throw that out there just to make a point that I think this is one of the benefits, and I think Bobby spoke to this last time. This is the benefit of EDAM and EIM, and we shouldn't forget about it as we go into the unhappy scenarios, which are going to be unhappy regardless of EDAM or EIM. But I think the unhappy scenarios are lessened, and the prospect of them are lessened because we have the opportunity for EDAM and EIM. So I will say that before we move on. Does anybody want to challenge my assessment?
Stuart Kelly from LA. Yep.
Well, Mark, I wouldn't challenge it. I would actually agree with it. This presentation and dialogue has been extremely helpful. So I would second that comment. So thank you for putting this on.
Okay. All right. Let's go to the completely unhappy scenario. All right. I laugh, and I also don't look forward to these days. But let's go ahead and see what happens. Next slide, please. Okay. So unhappy scenarios are basically now we're into emergency conditions. So what's an emergency condition? We have a contingency or we have a realized uncertainty that exceeds our capability. A single largest contingency that is greater than what we prepared for because it maybe is multiple contingencies or takes out multiple tie lines that take out more than what we expected under a single largest contingency. That's one potential. And as I stated before, if it's a single largest contingency and we are able to deploy our contingency reserves and we don't have enough contingency reserves, again, I think the fact that we have the imbalance reserve and the ability to optimally schedule that is an additional cushion that is able to absorb the above single largest contingency event if it were to occur. And so it actually, again, may avoid us going into an emergency state, but nonetheless, it's those types of events that are going to put us into an emergency state. The other thing that could put us into an emergency state, or some combination of it, is what happens if the uncertainty materializes beyond the level that we procured the imbalance reserve, which it says 95 or 97.5%, whatever we're procuring to, percentile for each of the balancing areas and the aggregate. So if that were to happen, then we are into emergency conditions. And the obvious question is, well, what happened to the transfer as we approach that emergency condition? And the transfer may or may not, well, it will still exist. It may have got counterflowed by market solutions that have occurred up to the point we're trying to meet the emergency condition itself. And if it gets to that point, we may have counterflows or we may have additional flows, but it will deploy whatever market capability it can. But we may not have enough market capability and imbalance reserve to meet the 95 percentile. So we're beyond, this is where George tried to express last time, we're beyond what the market can solve for here. We're into a true emergency condition. So we're now in that position, and we are going to start to see in the horizon of the market solution, the real-time market solution, we're going to start to see power balance constraint relaxations occurring. This is a trigger for the operator to take notice. This doesn't mean that we are going to shed load just because a power balance constraint has relaxed, but it is an indicator, it's a market indicator to the operator, get ready, things are getting tight, you need to start taking additional above market, out of market actions. So what are those out of market actions? So there's a whole slew of things that we have and other balancing areas have, and I enumerated some of them. These are probably not all of them, but we have additional conditional supply we can deploy. We have demand response we could dispatch. We have emergency assistance that we can call upon each other. It's funny because this emergency assistance was probably already occurring a little bit just because of the transfers back and forth, but if there, to the extent there's any additional emergency assistance we can get from our neighboring balancing areas, whether they're EDAM or non-EDAM, we would certainly endeavor and strive to do that. If there's any additional manual commitment of dispatch of resource capacity that is available to us, including declaring an emergency sometimes opens up additional capacity that is not normally available to us, we will endeavor to do that. Okay, so there's a lot of things that we will do either individually or as in coordination with our neighboring balancing areas to address the emergency condition. We could start interruptible demand options. There may be some additional special programs under emergency relief. Okay, so the whole thing, sort of things that we can get to. Now, if we're in the first hour and it's a contingency event, we can act, and we've deployed our reserves, we have 60 minutes to recover our reserves. While we're recovering those reserves, we may be identifying what additional actions we may need to take. We may, in that time frame, start to look at some of the lower priority exports if this is now not EDAM, but the lower priority exports that scheduled out of our system. We may need to take a look at those, and we will do it in a coordinated way, try not to surprise anybody so that the neighboring balancing area can respond. That may be an action that we're having to take. Okay, if all those things are exhausted, and two things can happen. This thing can get more unhappy. We could have another contingency event, in which case we may have already armed our firm load to be prepared for that next contingency event. If that next contingency event happens, okay, we're now in the situation where we may need to be in load shed. And this is where I am offering to you that under an EDAM, if we're all there together, I would offer that we should be both sharing in the benefits and then sharing in the pain at that point. And what I mean by that is the balancing area that has the event, the second contingency event, may have to shed some load, but they're also at the same time potentially reducing some of those transfers that occurred to a neighboring balancing area at that same time, which is equivalent to what we do with high priority exports. They're on the same level playing field and are susceptible to being cut when we are cutting our own load at that point per our tariff. So I don't want to ever be there. I think we should be designing everything to avoid being there, all the way from RA to the EDAM to the DAME, everything up to that point. But if we're in that corner, I will offer that at that point, load in area and load basically external demand through the transfers are at risk. Michelle.
Hey, sorry, Mark. I mean, I know you don't like me to talk about the edge cases, but just given that we've had a few of them, they're just what I think about and what I'm most concerned about. And I just want to go back to my original point, but one of which is that it just feels like perhaps CAISO will be closer to the edge because all of its resources will be offered into the EDAM market just by the virtue of the way we do resource adequacy. And that's where I got to the asymmetry issue, where other EDAM entities only have to put in their resource efficiency resources. So to the extent that they are concerned about those uncertainties between the day ahead and the real time, they can hold resources back to address that. So that's where I get to the asymmetry. I totally understand that you don't think California has excess resources, but to the extent we don't, we're putting them all out there in the day ahead. That's just one point. And then I just wanted to say that, we recognize that California is not flush with resources. And so the only way we're really exporting is based on imports. And so that just because we're a flow-through area, there is some vulnerability given that we are potentially going to support the EDAM transfers, which we know we can't support ourselves during stress system conditions because we need all of our resources, which means that those EDAM transfers are likely going to be based on EDAM imports. And so my worry is just that to the extent that any of those imports get cut off, that California would then have to support the export. So given that we're a large flow-through area, we can have 5,000 to 10,000 megawatts, that's a particularly difficult thing to handle. And maybe you guys have an idea for how this is not a problem, but that's just the way I see it. And then finally, with regard to the imbalance requirement, I know it's like a 95% confidence, but that leaves a certain amount uncovered. And so by design, it's not going with edge cases. And I just note that, in some of the work that you guys have done in the day-ahead market, that that we show that it doesn't cover the RUC adjustment. So the operators seem to know something that the imbalance reserve requirement doesn't. So I just raise these issues as my concerns, given the way the market's structured. So thanks.
So Michelle, I appreciate you raising the issues. I also appreciate the opportunity to have a further discussion with you to potentially show or demonstrate how those issues may not be an issue. I don't think I agree, but I can't express it right now clearly, why that asymmetry does not just lead ISO to be on the edge, why everybody else is holding capacity back. I understand what you're saying, but I guess I just don't see it that way in the context of the entire design. And I still maintain that under an EDAM, if you were to lose that intertie, I think you're still better off because you have collective response capability and broader capability to respond to it than just in your area through the imbalance reserve. So I'm not going to relieve you of your concerns today. I fully understand that, but I look forward to the opportunity to have further dialogue to try to address those concerns.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Let's go to Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Hey, great. Yeah, thanks, Mark and Mark. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Super high level. I heard you articulate a principle in here, Mark, that, during times of emergency events occurring, we need to recognize that we share the pain. I conceptually really agree with that. I think it's hard to say it, but it's something that I think we need to look straight in the eyes and acknowledge it. For a little context on where Vistra has been coming from and some of our concerns that we've been trying to raise is that, well, we really agree with that. We think that FERC's policies for open access, which includes curtailment priorities, in addition to scheduling priorities and reservation priorities, but focusing on the scenario, the curtailment priority piece, need to be respected and incorporated into the design. So we've presented background on those priorities in a working group meeting in a different effort, but related to this. And then we've also presented a proposal that would leverage the transmission loading release and provide just a little bit more transparency that we would incorporate an approach for the market to curtail or cut transactions that can't be supported in order of the reservation type that's backing it going into the market. I recognize it's slightly different functionality, but it largely builds off of our penalty prices, and we really do think it's workable, and it's something that could give folks more confidence that if they have a higher priority transmission backing it, then they'll be higher in the curtailment priority, and they won't be the first ones cut. And I know we presented, I think back in January 18th, and if you haven't seen some of those concepts, I hope you have, and I assume you have, but it really gets at this issue, yeah.
I've taken notice of them, and I do understand them. I think there's an overlay of, because I think they're the more traditional transmission priorities, and I'm just a little bit hesitant to say, okay, that has applicability here. It does have applicability, I guess, from the perspective of the transmission that's being made available, and if they maintain the priorities of the transmission that's being made available, I accept that there is an order of operation in terms of how those will be cut, and that's how they are cut today, external to the California ISO. I think the question the broader question you're raising is are those transmission priorities are now applicable maybe inside the California ISO, and that's something I need to think through, and how does that change the construct, and how does it overlay with some of the work that we're potentially working on in terms of transmission reservation. So there's a lot of things that opens up, and I'm aware of it, but I'm not prepared to just jump into and say, yep, that's the solution to this issue. And I think it's one element of the issue because that's a transmission derate or cut. I think we're talking about a broader set of contingencies here beyond just the transmission derate cut. So thank you for offering that.
No, of course. And I'm also thinking about generation contingencies as well, if it can be fed into the market, and the market could manage it. For instance, not just a transmission limit, it could also be a PBC relaxation that's needed, and that could trigger cuts. But I just want to lean in on one thing, Mark, real quick, is that I think in the context of EDAM, the question has been, how do we manage the seams issue and kind of recognize some of these realities that exist in external areas? So the way you framed it really would be a productive way to look at it and start with other areas have these practices. We know the market can do this. How do we enhance the market to do it? Was the conversation we had hoped to have and hope still. In the CAISO side, I also agree with you deeply that it's related to the issues that the proposal that will be put forward on the transmission services market priorities, which is why we've been coordinating our advocacy across these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen.
All right, let's go to Kevin Smith at Bank. And Kevin, if you wouldn't mind opining on, the last set of bullets there, after power balance relaxation, to be priorities that Mark laid out. resonate with you?
I think we're still grappling. I just wanted to get Kevin Smith with thanks. Sorry. I just wanted to get a clarification because I've heard maybe, and I may have not understood something George laid out before. So Mark, you had talked about, of course, we're in DEFCON situation and we're looking at curtailments and we're looking at prioritization. And you mentioned that we may have to look at some level at lower priority exports. So one of the conversations we had is we have the non-RA export, which is high priority. We use that for the resource sufficiency. I thought I understood based on our last discussion that once we move into the EDAM market and, we get a schedule from that comes out of the day ahead market, I didn't know whether it sounded from George's description that we're no longer really in that prioritization. Now we're all treated on par with internal demand. So it's we are kind of all in that same pool at that point. But what I heard you say, and that this was actually what I had assumed, is that there's kind of a ride through of that priority and it could reemerge in a certain system condition where you may have to look at scheduling priorities for those exports. But I didn't get that from a prior conversation. I just wanted, if you understand my question, which may not have been as straightforward.
I fully understand your question, and unfortunately, in 5 minutes or 4 minutes, I don't think I can do your question. I can do your question justice. I don't think I can do an answer justice to it. I would say between what I would be striving to do in answering that is that we should be able to replicate somehow what you get today in terms of high priority. And I would also postulate that if you really get down to that last bullet, I don't think that's much different from the high priority export in the sense that it is at risk under those extreme conditions where we are potentially shedding load internally. But there's several steps before there that I think we have to tie together between what George says. There can be economic displacement or redispatch, which I think is true, but it's only if there's a economic solution to be had, a feasible economic solution. So I think we can put those two thoughts together and still get you, I think, what you're maybe expecting or what you're asking. But I
was really just trying to get a clarification, Mark, because I wasn't sure what the value of the non-RA is outside of the RSE. Once I go in, it's clearly of value to me because it's part of my RA obligation. Yeah. But once the market runs and, I'm accepted, then was trying to figure. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. We can figure it out later, but leave you time.
Thanks. Bonnie.
Bonnie Blair on behalf of the 6 cities. So question for you, Mark. Does it make a difference to the application of everybody shares the benefit, everybody should, share the pain if pain becomes unavoidable. Does it make any difference if there is or are one or more BAAs who did not pass the resource sufficiency test in the day-ahead market?
I'm glad you asked the question because it's something I did not address earlier, and it's something I think we need to address. It's an open question. I think one argument that could be made is that while that resource insufficient balancing area was able to find a solution, they were able to find a solution, and it depends on what the consequences of that is. Did they pay a penalty? Did they have a different pricing mechanism? But they were able to find a solution. One argument is, well, they found a solution and they've paid for it. So why would they be indifferent? Alternatively, I could see the argument the other way that says, well, they didn't pass, so why should they enjoy all the benefits, including that sharing the benefit, sharing the pain step? Maybe they should go first. I don't know where I stand. I think that's a debatable question we need to still have.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate it's not an easy question. But I guess my gut feeling is it should make a difference, but I think further discussion is certainly appropriate.
Yeah. Okay, I'm at 3 minutes, and I'm out of material. I just want to say this has been a very helpful discussion that you allowed me to go through. Hopefully it was helpful to you in the overall context of resource efficiency, and I'm hoping it built some additional confidence in what our overall end-to-end design was trying to achieve, because I think this confidence issue is core to whether we can move forward on EDAM, and we have to be able to answer those questions. So I just want to say thank you again and look forward to the summary discussion on Friday. I couldn't have this summary discussion at this level of detail on Friday, and we're not going to, but I needed to have it here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate you sitting in and leading today's discussion. Bob Cott, did you want to provide your summation of today's call? And then Ellie, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the last slide in the other deck for the check-in.
Sure, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good, Bob.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll just be super high level given the time we have left. We had Mark here covering overview of the working group progress and some of the goals we're trying to reach with that. And then we jumped into some specific examples regarding the transfer, the EDAM transfer reliability concept, both for the happy path and what we say the emergency conditions path, and a lot of good comments, questions, discussion around those two topics, and kind of what we covered. Again, back to you, Mark.
All right. Well, I'm just going to echo Mark's comment. I really do appreciate everyone hanging in there. This has been a great working group, a lot of discussion. I look forward to this coming Friday, where we will be providing a briefing of this working group. And then just so everyone is aware, the ISO is working on a survey, and more details will be provided this coming Friday. These slides will be posted. Apologies again for the issue with the link. I believe they already have been posted, so feel free to go out and take a look, and we look forward to your engagement through the stakeholder process with EDAM. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.